Hey guys, welcome back. BDCKR here. We're back with our weekly Q&A video. This is season 10, episode 19. It's a video and podcast, I should say, because you can also access this on a bunch of different podcasting platforms as an audio-only format. Which honestly, even though we don't get any ad revenue from, is how I would probably recommend consuming this content if you're not particularly focused on the gameplay anyways.
That qualification is a big one, because to me, I think there's interesting things that you can see in the gameplay. This is what I miss about the replays. That if you're paying attention, if you're watching it a little bit thoughtfully, you can learn a lot of stuff. Sometimes we're able to pick it out and point it out to people.
Yeah.
But even there's nuances that I'm still picking up after literally years of playing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but for me personally, I would be doing my own thing.
That's true.
So I would not be watching anyway. So even if there's something I could get from it, I would not be getting that out of it anyways. Yeah. And if you're listening to it on a podcast, you can download it, take it with you when you can't necessarily be looking at your phone or device.
Right.
And you can also oftentimes do something else at the same time. So you could be making your own Injustice content for you to watch and also interact with while you're listening to it.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so before we get into the questions, so I'd like to, since you made that statement, I always like to talk a little bit about what the footage is. So this is a continuation of last week's recap where we've got Dawn of Justice Superman as the star. We have separated him from New 52 Wonder Woman, even though I think that team, almost any team with New 52 Wonder Woman, as long as she's got Justice League characters, is probably going to be among the best. And we've slotted him in with our usual sort of default. We used to have a default, I think, with Green Lantern, the Regime Green Lantern and animated Harley Quinn to drive power generation before Tantu Totem existed, so that you could really look at the third player who'd be the star.
Yeah.
Right? But now I find that the real setup is Hawkgirl Prime and either Rebirth Raven or, under specific circumstances, Red Lantern Hal Jordan.
Yeah.
And then you slot in the third player, and that third player gets to be the star. So Dawn Justice Superman's here. And one thing I do want to point out is that it really is the shattering gear. It shatters all of them at the same time. So there's that. I like that they do little subtle differences, right? It's not that Claw of Horror shatters gear the same way that Dawn of Justice Superman shatters gear. Dawn of Justice Superman shatters all the gear, but there's only 40% chance. And only if it lands unblocked and does some damage.
Yeah.
Because Astro Harness protects, Green Lantern, John Stewart Green Lantern's invulnerability protects, blocking protects. And the beauty of it is, though, I feel like it's handling Astro Harness way better. So in that 40% chance, if you've got somebody with Astro Harness, you get past their first invulnerability. On the first tag in, you don't have to tag in a second time to take advantage of Master's Death card to leverage Claw of Horus. It's enough of a benefit that I'm willing to give up that chance that it won't shatter the gear.
Yeah.
Because it's so sweet. So even with, say, like Revive gear, like Fourth World gear set, Astro Harness, all gone at once. It's beautiful.
So there we go. I think we'll get straight into our first question. Sometimes talk about games. I'm still playing Lethal Company. That game is still oodles of fun.
Yeah.
But there's nothing new on that front.
Oh, but we're watching Stumptown again. I'm watching Stumptown again. You're watching it for the first time.
It's very good so far.
Yeah.
It's nice and fun. It's a pretty easy watch, and it's pretty engaging.
It's mostly intelligent. Like, it's smart in a way, and what I feel like the best writers do really well, and it stands out because there's a lot of people who can't do it well, is dialogue.
Yeah.
So it feels like real people having conversations, but it still drives the plot without being sort of, you know how sometimes there's people do dialogue in a way, but not in a way that actually is in service of story, or some people do it in the service of story, but then it doesn't feel natural at all.
Yeah, and you said it was adapted from a comic.
Yes.
And I can feel it. It's got a little bit of that sort of campy goofiness to it for sure.
Yeah, see, and I don't see that, but I do feel that Greg Rucka, excellent writer, he's done a few things now that have been adapted for the screen. Stumptown is one of them. I believe Old Guard was another one of them. And Heart of Stone was another one. All really strong. I think the weakest is probably Heart of Stone, but they're all really good. And it's not necessarily comics, but I feel like when there's a source material that you're working from, there's at least the potential to do something really good because you're working from something that's already been
good enough to get adapted in the first place.
Right,
yeah,
exactly.
So there we go. The first question comes from Divine Carmona, and they say, I have a question. What are your thoughts on another Injustice YouTuber, Mizra? He's the reason people have been requesting a character tier list from both of you on this channel. He's been on YouTube for about as long as you two, initially selling tweaked accounts and now offering characters, currency, and gears. I'm curious about your perspective since you both advocate against hacking, yet he provides better deals than Warner. And so this is, I think, an interesting question.
I should point out, though, I don't watch Mirza's videos.
Yeah.
I know of Mirza only because we're in that space, and when people talk about YouTubers on the subreddit, then I'm aware of, who's been around and who's gone.
I think, to be fair, I don't know if he was the first person to do tier lists. I think people have been doing tier lists in the subreddit for a long time. So, but anyways, the point is that, he's a good example of how you can do a tier list for YouTube and how we would probably do it if we were to do one. We looked at that really quick before.
We looked at the thumbnail.
Well, yeah, whatever. But the format, we saw enough of the format that I know how he did it. Right? I don't watch the specific content. And then the second thing, which is the advocating against hacking, right?
Right.
Which is interesting because I don't actually think we do advocate against hacking. Actually,
right.
I think. Our stance has always been, and I think like the 30-second summary is that we are pro doing anything that doesn't negatively impact the experience of other players, as long as you're willing to take whatever associated risks that involves into your own hands. So like if you're hacking, you're violating Warner's terms of service and you might get banned, right? And if you get banned, that is like a fair consequence if you've hacked, right?
Sure.
I don't think I would not be meting out any consequences for hackers. I'm not going to judge anybody for hacking or whatever. And the stuff that I think is not good is when you're like putting stuff in online play or hacking yourself to the top of the leaderboard and stuff like that where you are noticeably negatively impacting somebody else's experience. It's not like, they would fight somebody else that had the same stats as you in defense. It's that you've put something in that nobody would have without hacking or cheating.
Right.
And so personally, I have absolutely no issue with the idea of hacks broadly, and if what he's selling is, tweaked accounts, characters, currency, and gears, that to me, none of that sounds like stuff that is negatively impacting somebody else's experience. So I don't personally have any issue with that.
Well, on the flip side, though, when you talk about negatively impacting, then there's also the negatively impacting the developers.
Yeah.
And this was more of an issue, I think, when the game was first released, right? Because the same idea where when the first people coming up with it will pay more to develop the idea and bring it to market. The same way developers are putting more into creating the game. So the company charges extra for the stuff because this is their business model of how they're recovering the cost that they put out to develop the game.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, that's a little bit interesting, right? Because if you never had to do anything except learn how to hack, I think it's easy to undercut the prices.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I guess I'm not as sophisticated. I don't have as clear an idea because I haven't really thought through the idea of like making a living doing this kind of stuff. Because on the one hand, I don't think the people who are paying for hacked accounts are the kind of people who would have spent money on the game anyways.
Yeah.
On the other hand, though, I'm not sure how confident I am in that assessment because I know that there are people who have, have spent a whole lot of money on the game. Like hundreds, maybe even thousands of dollars. And it boggles my mind because, I guess, one, I don't play a lot of games. And two, as far as I know about other games, the sort of the order of magnitude of what you're spending for, say, a AAA game is still less than $100, right?
Yeah.
Is it still? It is.
It is. Yeah. If you're not counting like DLC or like freemium games, which can often end up getting a lot more from you. Yeah. So to me, I think the main actual thing that I see with this is less, because you're right, there is that sort of impact on the developers potentially. It is taking money that might have gone to the developer's hands.
Right,
It's hard to argue. But, you know, when you're talking about piracy, when somebody's getting something for free instead of paying, it's hard to do that math and know how it would have been different. When you're talking about somebody paying for something instead of paying for that same thing a different amount of money or getting a different amount of stuff, then there's a more sort of direct argument for why you might be costing the developers money.
All right, so here's a funny story, like an interesting story. There's a writer, Maggie Stivater. I don't know how to pronounce her name. It's Stiefvater.
Yeah.
And she did an experiment with her books, because people used to always make the argument that, well, the people who were pirating your books wouldn't have paid money anyways.
Yeah.
And what she did with the release of one of her books as an experiment was seeded copies of the books. Either it was missing a bunch of it at the end, or it was corrupted in a way that you could read part of it, but not. I can't remember what it was. But after they'd seeded it, they were getting so many messages about how this copy is so crap. What's wrong with it?
Yeah.
And then people ended up buying the book. And so so maybe that wasn't all of it. There was another part where she saw that the amount of money dropped precipitously when there were actual real copies available for free.
Yeah.
So it was. I have to look it up because I didn't think we were going to be talking about this.
So what was the point? Was that it did cost her?
It did cost her, and she could see it like materially. Like she set up the experiment in a way to show that really there was a loss of income that people who were reading this would have otherwise been paying customers, like a large number of them.
Yeah. Yeah. No. So I think it's interesting. I think, you know, as like a little sort of side hustle, right, for him as a YouTuber, I think it's. I don't know. I mean, obviously, it's not a service that we've offered, and I think, sort of, I would be nervous, right, to advertise on my YouTube channel that is like a lot more associated with me, right? That I am like selling something which I think is at the very least in violation of Warner Brothers terms and services, but it might be illegal. I'm not sure. I'm not sure about the legality of it.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, but it's illegal in one of those things where I think that's divorced from whether or not it's moral. I saw something interesting actually, which was the idea of the way that we sort of, when somebody is proven right by history, that we stop using certain words to refer to them. So the idea that like the Black Panthers, right, the Black civil rights group in America, right, we call them a civil rights group now. What they were is terrorists. Right. Definitionally, legally, they were, you know, they were considered a terrorist group and a terrorist organization. But in sort of the current day, because there are a lot more people like them, right? A lot more people can sort of support their mission statement and a lot of the things they did, and there's a lot to point to how, you know, they materially improve the situation for Black Americans, right? People stop using the word terrorist or criminal, right? When a lot of these people were terrorists or criminals. And so the argument that I saw was basically that those words have they're a value judgment being made by the state and not by individuals and citizens. And so when you say somebody's a criminal, there's this association that makes them a bad person or a good person, right? And so that it's kind of important to use those words accurately, especially when you're looking at figures from the past who are now viewed in a lot more positive light, to say, you know, in this time, this person was a criminal. These people were terrorists. You know, who were criminals and terrorists? The Underground Railroad, right? When they were funneling, you know, Black people out of slavery, right? Those people were criminals and terrorists. And nobody talks about them that way. But it's important to have that understanding on your belt. Not because, you know, all criminals and terrorists are good people. That's not the point. But that you should be able to divorce your own morality from the morality of the state. Because sometimes it's happened in the past, it's happening now, it's going to happen in the future. The state gets it wrong, right?
Well, not just the state. I think society. Culturally, that there's at least... Change is hard. And when you have a paradigm shift of something big, that the people who are responsible for that shift, the things they had to do get whitewashed a little bit, because in the end of the day, we recognize that what they did was right. But at the time, there was a lot more resistance to what they were saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's like Martin Luther King, right?
Mm-hmm.
People forget that
he was like the most hated man in America.
He was.
Yeah.
And it's only in retrospect that people who probably would have, if they lived in his time, would have hated Martin Luther King, are able to say, well, he was so peaceful and he was so... Yeah. Because they have Malcolm X to contrast him with. Yeah. And I think there's something... I read something that there were certain things that they agreed upon, especially when you look at that letter that Martin Luther King wrote about the moderate.
Oh, yeah.
And how he really castigated the moderates for being almost worse. It's, it's like the idea where if somebody's awful to you to your face or somebody's awful to you behind your back.
Yeah.
And that difference, while it might feel nicer because you don't have to confront it when it's behind your back, it can sometimes be a little bit more... It undermines what you do even more.
Well, I'm sure I've talked about this, but probably years ago. There's actually research on this, specifically with black patients in a healthcare context, right? Mm-hmm. And so there's two types of bias. What you're talking about, to your face and behind your back, right?
Yeah.
There's implicit and explicit. Implicit is what's in their head, and explicit is what they show to you.
Right.
So somebody who's explicitly biased says racist things and acts in a verifiably racist way.
Right.
You go, I know that person is a racist because they told me they were racist, either directly or not in those words, but very clearly, right? And then implicit bias is a kind of thing where you might have, for example, false information. And this is a real example that like black people experience less pain, right?
Right.
Or that women have a higher pain tolerance, right?
Right.
And those two things lead to, medication being underprescribed for women and black people. And then if you're a black woman, like doubly underprescribed, right?
Right.
And so they did a study and they basically found that black patients preferred, obviously, somebody who is just not biased implicitly or explicitly. That is somebody who doesn't think racist stuff, does not behave in any way differently to either group, and also doesn't, seem racist, right?
Right.
But then the second preferred group was somebody who has actually had explicit bias, but lower on implicit bias. So they would rather somebody have, act in a verifiably racist way, and then after that, it was high for both. And then the worst thing was to have a high implicit bias and low explicit bias, because if it's not visible to you, you don't have the proper tools to deal with it and address it. You don't know what you're working with, right? You're not in a situation where you go, this guy's racist,
right,
and he's going to do a bad job with my care,
right,
so I need to fight him. This is somebody talking to your face,
right,
who seems like they're on your team, but then is undermining the quality of your care.
Right.
And so it's one of those things where it turns out that it's like there's good research backing up that you would much rather have explicit bias than implicit, and that the way that you show it to your face and behind your back makes a big difference, but not the way that you might think.
Mm-hmm.
In a not fully intuitive way.
But to me, it actually makes sense, right? Like, do you want to have hidden dangers?
Yeah.
Or do you want to have visible dangers?
The devil you know, right?
The devil you can see.
Yeah.
And potentially avoid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's interesting.
Yeah, but so anyways, that's just sort of the larger conversation on morality, is that you do need to say it with a caveat, because if I said, the criminal organization, the Underground Railroad, that would make you maybe think some really uncharitable things about me, even though I was only stating a fact. You go, ooh,
right.
Are you trying to come after? But if you say, I am being value neutral, they were criminals in their time, I think what they did was unambiguously the right thing to do.
Right.
It helps you sort of reframe and maybe think for yourself a little bit more when you're evaluating things, and not using those sort of labels prescribed by other people to steer your own,
not even necessarily the labels, right? But appreciating the nuance of the difference between being morally right and being legally right.
Yeah. So when I'm saying that, I think hacking is like legally not allowed, I'm not saying that as in I think it's like a morally bad thing. Mm-hmm. But my main thing is like, we, for example, would you post sneak previews that involved, having somebody hack and access the characters,
right,
and then give us access to those accounts so that we could show them off.
That was
right?
a long time
ago.
Yeah.
So we have no problem with hacking. And in that case, we were even getting stuff that nobody else could get, right?
Right.
But we weren't taking it into online play. We sort of didn't cross our own personal line with it.
Right.
And to me, a few lines further would be if we were if we had a shop page up in the description of our YouTube account to say buy from my team, and I'm pretty sure at the size that he's at, his team is probably him. Maybe he's got other people. It might be other people. My guess is that it's him and maybe like a friend or two, right? Yeah. At the size that he's at, the fact that we're at like a comparable-ish size, I can't imagine that he's got, you know, like contract workers and that he has like a, you know, like a biz, like he's a licensed business, especially because that's not something that I think you could license as a business, because they would go, hey, you're not allowed to do that. Yeah. You can't have a business doing something that you're not allowed to do. But anyways, the point is that I would not feel super comfortable posting it and talking about it like he did. With that being said, I hope that he doesn't face, you know, consequences for it, because I don't think, for whatever it is, you know, it's particularly worthwhile like litigating that sort of thing. And by like consequences, I mean, I guess like if an account got banned, I don't know how I feel about that. I have to think a lot more about it, but I hope he's never in any like legal trouble or anything from that.
Right.
But that's kind of my opinion on it. I don't think it's like a bad thing to hack broadly, but that's not how I would have did it personally.
That's not how you roll.
Yeah.
Fair.
How about you?
Yeah, you know, I guess I'm torn. I mean, you're right, though. The big part of it isn't necessarily that we have a big stance on it, is that just we don't do it on this channel.
Yeah.
Because that would take away from the parts that are actually more important to us. See, what's ridiculous, and I think it's addressed in one of the later questions if we get to it, is that this is a pretty darn good game.
Yeah.
Like, it's almost ridiculous to me, because we're a funny combination, right? Like, I almost play no other games.
Yeah.
With the exception of AliExpress Merge Boss.
Yeah.
And now I'm also playing Settlers of Catan online with some old friends from high school.
Okay.
And that you play a lot of other games. But that there's something there that, I mean, if it's not obvious with the gameplay that you're seeing every week of different characters cycling through different teams, I'm still enjoying this.
Yeah.
Now, I will admit, I probably wouldn't be playing nearly as much if we didn't have to create footage for this channel.
Yeah.
But I would still be playing.
Mm-hmm.
And there's nothing else that has held my attention for as long as it has. It's a great game.
Yeah.
And I would feel bad about making, like you said, making things worse for other players, or taking things away from the developers.
Yeah.
So
there we go.
I think it's nuanced. I mean, there's so many things that are nuanced, and it's easy to misinterpret things like that by painting everybody with the same brush.
Yeah.
Right? Like, to me, should we get into it? It's like right now between Palestinians and Jewish people. And I'm very careful about that, right? Because it's not about Hamas and Israel, which are two different things.
Yeah.
And people who are watching the discussion who have a vested interest or involved in the discussion.
Well, it is like about both, but a lot of people are having conversations on one level or another and making it about both simultaneously.
Yeah, they're talking past each other.
It's very hard to, Yeah,
they're talking past each other, but intentionally. Yeah. I think there's a good faith way to have that discussion and say, it's really bad to kill women, children, civilians, to kidnap people, who are non-combatants, who are not involved directly. And it's another thing to say, well, the people who are responsible deserve to be punished, and they shouldn't be doing it. And it does, just because if you don't like it, you know what? I think I might have said this before. Just because Rob Ford is not a great premier in Ontario, and just because he got elected in a majority government, but in a first past the post system where only a minority, but a plurality of people voted for him, you cannot judge everybody in Ontario based on what that number of people voted in.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're not Rob Ford supporters.
No.
But we live in Ontario.
Mm-hmm.
And I know it's not really a great example, because it's not like Ontario's done any extreme stuff to other people yet. We've just been screwing our own people by putting in, because our government was putting policies that have been harmful. Mm-hmm. But it's the same kind of thing, I think, that, nuance. Nuance, baby.
Mm-hmm.
Was that only one question?
That was only one question. Have one more question. We'll do one quick, So, Nora Klimek, who is actually our newest Patreon supporter, who you'll hear about so much in, I guess, a minute.
Yeah.
We'll get into thanking you again right after we answer your question. It says, About the Jessica Cruz team, the team does still do pretty well in Survivor, particularly with Ibistic on Jessica. When the saw blade hits the opponents, it applies Ibistic damage over time, like 8 times, so their health depletes very fast. Then, if you gear Red Sun Green Lantern with super tanky gear, he can survive a lot, and in the later rounds of Survivor, using Jon Stewart with Astro Harness, Claw of Horus, and Enchantress helps to get rid of the super oppressive gear.
Right. So not even like 8 times. Literally, it does 8 times. So it triggers the 10% damage 8 times. Because there's bleed damage from the gear itself, what you're going to get is, I think, like 96% health on one hit of the Special 2 from the damage. Not just from the damage of Special 2, but the damage over time. Yeah. So this is the great equalizer. So why it's so great
It's not even the great equalizer. It lets you, like, just absolutely destroy whoever you're fighting.
Well, what I mean by equalizer, though, is that when you're facing somebody who's got way more health than you do, when their health pool far exceeds what your attack is able to dish out, you're hitting way above your weight class.
Yeah. Oh, but my argument is that this makes you stronger than them. It's not even an equalizer. This is like an unfair advantage against anybody, and specifically in Survivor. That's where it really makes the biggest difference.
So what would be funny is if you had a team where Jessica Cruz was the weakest.
Yeah.
And you shoved it into Survivor and ended up burning through all the opponents, right? Like, really, it's a matter of manipulating the teams enough so that she doesn't take any damage. But that would be kind of funny.
It would be.
So, absolutely. So, that's one of the contexts that we miss a lot, too, because I have to admit, as much as I'm still playing Injustice, I'm not playing Survivor very much because I think we've got everything that we need from it.
Yeah.
We've crit chance and crit damage augmented all the people we need to. We've got enough augmentations that we don't need to do more. We've got all the Survivor gears.
Yeah.
And at this point, it's really just to get a challenging fight where you can still compare it, right? Like the range between fight 1 and fight 7 of Ultimates there's a range to it, but the difference between demonstrating Survivor in fight 1 or fight 12 or 13 or 14 is huge. And I think there's not as much variety and not as much transparency about what you're dealing with, right? Because in multiplayer, not only are your teams closer to you, but you get to see what their loadouts are, like what the gears they have. And it's just, I guess, it's our own bias.
Yeah.
Because we play a certain way, but it's good to remember that there's definitely different ways of playing. And the other sort of redheaded stepchild of Injustice is the... what do you call it? The story mode?
Yeah.
The offline play.
Well, because once you're through it, there's not as much, I guess, grinding credits, but most of the time, challenge makes more sense as long as you can do that.
Right. It's really the experience, but then once you get good enough, so there's a difference, like if you can push them high enough, maybe like level 42 or 43 at bonus battle 6, then doing multiplayer, there's just more joy, more benefit, more reward.
Yeah, well, and the other thing too is that you get the experience no matter what, you know? No matter what you're doing, eventually the experience will be there. So you need to worry about it the least. If you're optimizing your time for money, the experience will happen by accident in the background. Yeah. Anyways, I think that'll do it for this week. Yeah. So to finish up, we'd like to give a huge thank you to our patrons on Patreon.
That would be Michael Devries, Irvin Ruiz, Hoshi127, and our newest patron, Nora Klimek.
Nora.
Did I say? What did I say?
I think you said Norma. I can't tell.
Oh my god.
But we should make sure that we are doing the name right. At least the first time.
Yes. They're supporting us on the credited level. Thank you so much for continuing to support us and for beginning to support us directly like that.
Yeah.
You're seeing also a few other names on the screen who have been our patrons at some point during the pandemic. And thank you all for watching, because if you weren't watching, there wouldn't really be any point to this channel. Or listening. Well,
if you're listening, we actually don't get any ad revenue, so there's not. No, I'm joking. Yeah. It's okay. However you're consuming it, I specifically tell you to listen whenever I talk about it. Anyways, so thank you so much for your support in whatever form that takes. We'll see you next time.
Komoda.